Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Dr. Matt Englar-Carlson, professor and department chair in counseling at California State University Fullerton, where he also directs the Center for Boys and Men. A core author of the APA Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Boys and Men, he co-created the positive psychology, positive masculinities model to foster strength-based, healthy masculinities in schools and community settings. His books include In the Room with Men, Counseling Troubled Boys, A Counselor's Guide to Working with Men, and the upcoming Listening to the Voices of Men in Therapy and the Therapists Who Work with Them. He serves on Movember's Global Men's Health Advisory Committee. I'm wondering if you do grow the mustache during Movember. And the advisory board for the Positive Masculinity Foundation, and is clinical advisor for the men's mental health app Mental. His work emphasizes healthy boyhood and how it impacts education in schools and community settings nationwide. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, very excited to chat. So you were instrumental in creating the APA guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men, which sparked significant conversation in our field. I'm curious about your experience being at the center of that process. What drove the need for these guidelines, and how do you reflect on both the reception they received and the conversations they generated about how we understand and work with boys and men?
Thank you, Wes. And it was a really interesting process to be involved in that. And when a part of that question in terms of the need, I think that there is a recognition, or there was at that time. This actually began in around 2005, 2006. So even though the guidelines weren't published until 17, 18, so it took a while to get them done. And I'll talk about why that's the case. At that period of time, American Psychological Association was working on practice guidelines across a variety of kind of populations and settings and concerns. At the core, guidelines are not very exciting. Let's just start with that. At least they shouldn't be very exciting. They're a very clinically oriented document. They're for kind of practicing therapists, and in that sense, it's actually written for psychologists. Of course, they apply to probably any practicing therapist. And they really meant to kind of like coalesce. So here's some of the information that exists, and here are some kind of practice kind of guidelines or ways in which you can work to address those concerns. Guidelines only happen when there's actually an empirical base to kind of draw from. And so many people might wonder, it's like, well, is there an empirical base in the psychology of masculinities? And the reality is like, yes, and it's robust. People have been working in this area for, at this point, 50 years. There's a lot of research. And so these guidelines, as they begin to evolve, it's a committee process initially. A lot of people involved, kind of, I would say like the main authors, researchers in the field all come together and they talk about kind of what the research says. And then they boil down to a handful of kind of statements or practice areas to kind of focus on. When these guidelines were began, usually this is like a pretty quick process, 2 or 3 years, it kind of happens, and this thing took forever. But, in some ways it makes sense. So it took a while, because if you can go back and you think about like, so how are we talking about gender, or how are we talking about men, let's say in 2005, okay? That's not how we were talking about men actually, or gender in 2010 or 15, meaning that our conversation about gender has evolved dramatically. And so it's our understanding of gender, whether it's the science or the research, but just our normal conversation in terms of words that we begin to use. And so if you think about guidelines, right? If the guidelines don't reflect society, or they don't reflect what, let's say, clients are bringing up in session, they're not terribly useful. So the guidelines, we would have drafts get ready to go, and then we'd go back and look at them and say, well, I don't know, like it seems like there's some things happening that we haven't addressed yet. And that was going on and on and on. And you can imagine that can go on forever until at some point you say, like, we have to stop. So, anyway, these guidelines get created. They go through lots of review boards, like lots of review boards. And like I said, they aren't very sexy. They're not very interested. These things get, there's a press release, they go out, and everyone just yawns because it's not a very interesting thing. In the case of these guidelines, there's kind of two things that kind of are at the core of it that make it a bit more interesting. One is that gender is political. So it's political no matter what. If you think about how gender was talked about in the last election, how it's being talked about now, it's political and everyone has opinions on it. So you may have like a research-based opinion on other kinds of topics, on economic policy or your thoughts on fuels and fossil fuels or whatnot, but that maybe come through some lived experience, but a lot of it's through kind of what you've learned over time. But for gender, it's through lived experience. So everyone has lived experiences about gender, and the research does suggest that we also have implicit bias about gender. In fact, it's the strongest implicit bias that we have. So when you encounter another human being, what that means is the first thing that we think about or experience implicitly is gender. So we see gender essentially, we load our biases based on that, and then other things load as well: height, attractiveness, race, class, appearance, all these other kinds of things. But gender is the first, and it's often the strongest held. So I say that meaning that when these things come out, and then the second thing is, and there was some controversy, meaning that they weren't released in the appropriate way, which means to say that it's not like the writers or the authors do marketing. We don't. We're academics. So we write this thing, and then the organization kind of sends them out. And someone put out a tweet about, hey, these guidelines are coming out, and they put out the wrong tweet, which they put out something that basically said, like, being male is harmful to your health. I mean, that's exactly what it said. But the reality is that that's not what the guidelines said. And that raised a lot of controversy because, again, if gender is political, people have strong biases about it. And people are watching kind of what you might consider like, the war on men or kind of how are men doing. That falls smack dab into this political conversation where immediately one side is thinking, wait a minute, here's a group that's saying that being men is unhealthy. Essentially being a traditional man is unhealthy. We need to push back on that. Me as the writer saying, wait a minute, that's not what we said. And then having to defend yourself, but it just led to, again, that happened at a perfect storm around the Me Too movement. And all of a sudden we're talking about gender in a different way in contexts and outlets that probably were never talking about it before.
You bring up a good point. I think that's right. And very rarely do we even go to the source, aka reading the guidelines, which is why
Right.
most people are yawning. But yeah, and being from an organization and in a field that does lean a certain political bend, there tends to be some overcorrelation there that I don't think is fair. And I have found a lot of the men I work with, I'm curious if you have too, struggle with this tension to feel like, hey, I'm being asked to open up and share and to participate in my mental health and to be vulnerable and all these things. And yet my experience in therapy is often I have too much empathy given to me. Oh, that's really hard. And then I'm just kind of left aimless, or I feel this apprehension from either the therapist or the organizations at large that feel like we got to deal with them, I don't know how accurate that is, but
It's really unfortunate that in a way, like it's fortunate that this controversy comes out because people then begin to have some conversations maybe they weren't having before. And, that's great, you know, but, if we look at the quality of our dialogue in the larger kind of sphere in politics, usually it's not a lot of conversations. It's a lot of kind of people screaming on different sides without listening to the other person. And if you listen really loud to that, what you might think is like, wait a minute, this group that's supposed to be the helpers, have these opinions and towards men, opinion towards me, and now why would I ever want to go to them, right? Which again also feeds into this narrative that a lot of them might experience, which is, therapy isn't really for me. And if I go there, they're going to tell me things either I don't want to know, or they're going to tell me things that I know already that I don't want you to remind me of. And again, almost every single person I've ever experienced who went to therapy, at the core, what they want is to be understood. And if you have this belief that this field is not going to understand me, why would I go? Right. And I think again around that, it's like there's ways in which, I mean, what the guidelines actually said is actually, again, it's not that being traditional is unhealthy for your health, but essentially rigid masculinity or actually having rigid kind of beliefs about it, which then correlate to our behavior, is unhealthy. There's 40 plus years of data saying that's true. Right. But that's not, but and again, being rigid about most things actually is unhealthy. Let's just be clear about that, right? Because the key to usually psychological health is adaptability and being flexible. But again, if you take that and you think, well, that, means all men are that way, then it sounds really horrible, right? And that's not really what was said. And the reality is like my background is actually healthy masculinity. So I'm not going to be writing guidelines about toxic masculinity or writing guidelines that are going to kind of turn guys away from going to therapy. I'm actually trying to write these in a way because I know, again, most of the readers this may be the first time they've even encountered this subject area. So we want to educate so they actually have more empathy towards men's experiences and understanding like why they might experience conflicts around kind of what society says they're supposed to be and who they are. And how do you navigate that in a helpful way? But again, it gets all messed up. And then in the middle of that, you have clients, right, who are trying to figure out how am I going to seek help, right? And the reality is, like you said, is that there is stigma in the world for men to go seek help from people like you and I. And part of this is because people like you and I haven't done a very good job of welcoming them into their offices.
Hmm.
So I agree. Like, I think part of my soapbox these days is thinking about like, I've done a lot of work in this field and had a lot of conversations and a lot of presentations and a lot of articles. And, this notion of kind of therefore trying to kind of improve the psychological help of boys and men. And the needle hasn't changed that much. And so, what think we're still in this place where we kind of say, well, here, we are. I'm ready to work with you. Why don't you want to come in and see me? And the reality is, if we reverse that and think about it differently, like I think now more is that why is it that as a field that we clearly have a population that needs help and we offer such crappy services that they don't want to come to us? So that's on us, not men. But I mean, there's things on men, but that's on us. Like, and it's not just marketing. It's not that we market therapy bad. It's actually the experience of many men in therapy is not good. And so we turn them off at this moment when they have this slight window of coming and they may never come back again.
Yeah, that's a good point. And they're usually pressured by an external source, usually a female partner to come. There's not that internal motivation, let's say. But I agree. I think we need to certainly not placate, but I think certainly actively make space for that, to see it as a positive thing. And actually, your positive psychology, positive masculinities model represents a really interesting shift towards more strength-based approaches rather than the deficit focus we were just mentioning. When it comes to masculinity, I'm really fascinated by this reframe. I'm curious what led you to develop this model and what does it look like in practice when you are working with boys and men who've been told their natural tendencies are somehow problematic or toxic.
Yeah. Getting into this field for me was very natural, being that I was a grad student. Before that, I was like, I worked in schools as a counselor and I had a lot of boys I worked with, but worked with a lot of girls. And primarily in the school I worked in, which was a K-8 school, the overwhelmingly population who's in that school is actually girls and adult women as the teachers and moms. My early experience is actually being much more grounded in like women's studies and actually feminism, and seeing that my clients essentially represented that too. The meaning that it was girls and moms who wanted to see me and boys who were dragged to me by the assistant principal. But I found that actually I really liked working with boys and it was fun. And I moved then into grad school and I realized, like, when I look across my caseload and I was seeing clients, what I enjoyed most was working with men. And again, and I don't mean this in a boasting way, it wasn't that hard. Meaning that I found that I could naturally relate to guys. And I enjoyed those conversations. And I realize now, I think what I enjoyed about it is it loosened me up too. Like, I wasn't so rigid when I worked with men. I kind of fell back into some well-worn habits in terms of kind of creating friendships growing up and having, a lot of chit chat and a lot of talk about nothing, which is rapport building, but then finding ways to have that mean something, and then finding ways to kind of understand maybe some of the natural um, factors that would turn guys off into therapy, finding ways to kind of turn that on, right? So that they wouldn't be so spooked by me. And I found that really kind of natural. And at the same time, I'm also really excited that, wait a minute, there's this field called the psychology of men and masculinity, and I can do a dissertation in this and I can research this. And so I got really hungry. Like, I read everything I could possibly read. And just based on my upbringing and kind of how I was raised to be pretty interdisciplinary across the board. So even though my dad was a psychologist and, was my school counselor and a big influence on my life, he also was very interdisciplinary. Like he would read all kinds of things. And so I was reading psychology and sociology and family studies and anthropology and women's studies and Foucault and French philosophy and postmodernism. And I was reading all of these other kind of things to kind of get at and how do they see masculinity? And that really broad base, I think, really helped me coming into the field and, think a lot. It really stretched my thinking, and at the same time, I'm also really steeped in this psychology and masculinity field and looking at the research and engaging in the research and doing the research and again, being hungry. Then fast forward a couple of years later, as I'm in this, I'm also, you know, as a therapist, really influenced by postmodern kind of solution focused, kind of narrative lenses, but also I grew up Adlerian. Like I literally grew up Adlerian because my dad was an Adlerian psychologist and all of his friends were Adlerian psychologists and I was parented that way. And so my orientation to the world is an Adler kind of mentality, which is a growth orientation, right? I mean, Adler was the original positive psychologist. He was the one who was interested in kind of, again, he believed you could change over time, whereas contemporary Freud believed you couldn't, right? And Adler was always looking at the social interaction, ways to kind of grow in that. And Freud was very much thinking about negativity and kind of, so as I began to look at the research that I was reading and contributing to, I began to kind of wonder, like, does this encapsulate me? Like, is all the work I'm reading, does this capture me? Does it capture my friends? Is it the totality of who we are? Because it seems to me like we're really learning a lot about all the problems that men have in the world. And I don't think I'm just a collection of problems. I'm not just a collection of internal conflicts. I'm not just, essentially a mold by society, right? I think I have some pushback on that. I mean, I think me as an individual also have a way in which I've changed society. And I began to kind of have these conversations with some colleagues around because I also noticed in therapy is that, yeah, some of what I was learning was helping me explain kind of men's distress, but I wasn't getting an explanation of men's health. So okay, now I know where you've been and I know the wrong turn you took, right? But where's my map now to tell you how to get out of that wrong turn, out of that alley, right? And there weren't conversations about what is health, and I think for me, again, like if you don't understand where you're going, it's really hard to know where to point the compass. And I began to kind of think much more about so are there other ways in which we can think about men's lives, right? Is it just problematic or is there growth oriented? And kind of tell me about, are the conflicts really all these rigid notions, right? Or, but I was thinking yeah, I was raised to be independent and I was raised to kind of be pretty stoic and, but not stoic in the way I was reading about in the research, maybe more stoic in the stoic philosophers, meaning that there's a way in which emotional restraint actually led to strength in moments, right? Yet at the same time, I could be stoic. And yet I was also, not fully in touch with my emotions because I was a young man, but I was certainly in touch with my emotions. And that was actually a good part of me. And I began to kind of think much more about again, from a constructivist perspective, right? Context matters, right? And context influences how we are. And wouldn't the context also then influence how these kind of traits, and again, I use traits in a broad sense because they're human traits, right? But they're socialized in certain ways in men. Don't those traits actually kind of lead to some actually positive elements of our lives too? And just in having and I realized that even as a therapist, I was kind of having these conversations anyway with men. Like I wasn't just parroting research I was reading, like I was altering it in my experience, which is why I think I was finding it kind of easy and why I think my male clients were sticking around. And the last point here is that, and in group more than any other place, I was seeing this because group was a place in which guys typically had a chance to kind of overcome some of those initial fears. And then in a group, like in men's groups, like these are very male oriented spaces, I would begin to see like this nurturing component come out in which guys took care of each other. And I began to see the ways that playfulness and humor weren't, defenses, but they were truly ways in which guys were sharing their personality and care for each other, right? And so again, I can think about nurturing and emotional expression in a very male-oriented way in which it's actually quite beautiful. right? And I could also see ways in which guys could turn that off when it needed to be turned off. And it just really altered the way I was thinking about the work I was doing and also my contribution to creating a bias. Because I guess I'd say the last thing is that because I realized that when I would go in with kind of this bias that again, men are a series of conflicts, that's when guys were looking at me like, I don't think that's me. And they weren't being seen.
Yeah, they weren't. Yeah, I resonate deeply with that natural connection with guys, and in some ways, it is healing for you as the therapist to, like you're saying, tap back into your own core essence. Because, like you said, with initially that bias that we have is gender based, and we naturally feel most safe around those who look most like us and that share our experiences. And being in another space, even in a younger version of a boy, I mean, and we could take it another level where there's a level of innocence that I think gets restored when you work with boys and young men that a lot of every man had at some point. And then, like you said, it turned off. And then when you get back into a space where they feel safe, that comes out again. I mean, that's kind of the whole trope that boys will make middle school jokes, even if they're, grown men, because there's that thing in them that still needs to be nurtured. And it sounds like what you're saying that so much of the boyhood that gets shut off into manhood needs to be nurtured and loved. And in fact, has a real prominent presence as a man in groups. Obviously, it needs maturing. To your second point, and I also associate with this too, is I find a lot of men want to feel dignified. They actually don't want to be let off the hook. And they're being asked by their female partners, in a sense, get your shit together. Like, I want you to have direction. I want you to have meaning. I want you to be assertive. And many men are coming saying, what does this look like for me? But I feel like I need to put something together. I like that Adlerian framework of aiming towards something and growth and this sense of working towards the authenticity of who you are. And I'm curious, any tips you would give someone in that framework, a young guy who's he needs to mature and says, where do I start? What does this look like in that framework? Some things that may get them going.
I agree with you. I think most men and most boys and most adolescent males, like, again, they're finding themselves in front of people like us, usually because some external force has brought them there. So whether it's their mom or the teacher or the principal, or later on their girlfriend, partner, wife, right? Or judge, boss, EAP program, something has drawn them there and says, you need to be here, right? Or else, right? And yeah, I certainly have had men who are there on their own, but that's not typically the pathway, right? And so that guy who's coming in, because someone else has externally drawn them, does that mean that he has no idea why he's there? Like, I know enough to know that once I ask a guy and say, why you're here? And I say, it's because, my boss is a jerk. It's like, okay, I get that. And I know at some level he knows that he's a jerk too, though, right? And I think, like, at some level, I know that guys have some understanding that essentially they aren't so blockheaded that they don't see that they've got faults. The reality is that the shame that men experience on the inside is often so strong that the defense is so strong to protect themselves, which is why the boss is a jerk and the judge is a jerk and all these things are kind of happening, right? So if I am going to then pile on to that, right? So my opening remark to you is like, tell me why you're here, right? I know as the what you're going to tell me is a litany. Like, I know why you're here. Like, does it start with, I already know why you're here, right? And you know that I know why you're here because I usually got a report that says why you're here, right? So if my opening is like, I want you to tell me all the shit you did that got you in trouble to be with me, you know, automatically your defenses go up. You start with, like, it's almost like a dog that's in trouble. Like, you hang your head and you're like, all right, let me tell you how I shouldn't have dug that hole, but I dug a lot of holes, and I used to start talking about the holes. And I can see it's like that our engagement now is an adversarial engagement, as opposed to, Wes, help me understand where you'd like to be. I mean, for some guy, help me understand the man you want to be. Help me understand the father you want to be. I realize you're here because you're having difficulties with your partner. Help me understand the partner you want to be, right? The husband you want to be. And that actually, again, I'm not excusing the behavior, right? I'm not saying, like, let's act like that stuff never happened, because I know it's going to come up, but I'm not starting there. I'm starting with actually growth. I'm starting with potential. I'm starting with a future oriented model, which is tell me where you'd like to go, right? Because I don't know a lot of people who say, honestly, I really want to be the shittiest husband. I want to be the worst employee and the worst father too. Like like most men want to be great. They want to be exceptional. They want to be better than the people who came before them, right? And somewhere along the way, they got stuck. So again, I just know that is the shift that's going to kind of happen, which is again, then I'm also going to be listening for the strengths you're offering to me. And I'm going to be listening for the ways in which you're adaptive about those. And I'm going to be listening for the ways that you're actually maladaptive around that, right? So I'm going to be listening for the places where you have potentially some rigidity about that. And it's not just rigidity in beliefs, it's often rigidity in behavior in ways. And so, like, again, independence is a great way of thinking about that. I think that guys take a lot of pride in being independent, being their own man, being a good provider. We're socialized in some ways to want to be on top, right? And there's something really amazing about that. But I also know that society is very pluralistic, and we also really benefit from being in community, and we really benefit in cooperation. And a lot of the models in terms of how we think about parenting based on reality is egalitarian, so that also leads to some ways in which maybe there needs to be some shared decision making in some places. And how do we figure out where you want to share, and how do we figure out where you can have your pride? And you can have pride actually in shared decision making too, because I say that meaning that we know that overall women are more employed than men. We know that actually, yes, women make more overall, but we know that women's access to economic power has changed dramatically over the past 50 years. We know that there's a lot of dual income couples, right? And in those dual income couples, even if it's a female partner who makes more money, which is often the case, the guy often still wants to feel a sense of pride that he provides, right? So despite the economic reality, that kind of mentality is still strong. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Unless it's getting in the way of kind of their relationship. But like, he can actually still find ways to have pride and be a provider, right? So often that conversation is kind of maybe shifting a bit of thinking about what goes into your criteria for that, right? And if it's just money, if that's the only criteria, well, that might be problematic if you're not bringing in, if you just have a different job, frankly, right? But there may be other ways in which you can kind of build that criteria where you still feel that sense of pride. So I think that's often how I'll shift that model, which I'm going to look for strength, I'm looking for growth. And so yeah, maybe you're not making as much money, but I notice how responsible you are, right? And how critical it is for you to make sure that everyone's okay in your family all the time, and you wear that proudly, right? So I can build up kind of elements that he's doing well, as opposed to like, all right, so you're not making enough money. Where else are you? How are you doing on the chores? Like, where else are you kind of faulting? And again, because that's just what I mean. What I would say is that I think for a lot of guys, at least in Western society, like, we're quite shame based, because a part of male socialization is feeling like you're never enough. It's feeling like you always have to kind of fight to prove yourself. Like, that's precarious masculinity model, right? That hard fought, easily lost. It's like you're fighting for status, always looking over your shoulder, because at any moment you can be knocked off the top of the hill. And I think in that mentality, like, guys are often really aware where they're not, and again, I think like, if therapy is another place where they feel like they're not enough, because I actually had guys come in and like get competitive in therapy. I'm not, how am I doing? Like, no, and I see it in group a lot, right? And until you don't, does that make sense? Like, and when that stops, that's when the group gets, group is really working.
Yeah, that's all hitting home in a very deep way. And yeah, I agree. I think there's a few reasons why we have such a rigid mindset. I think the models we've been given are very narrow because we've seen success primarily in sex and money. And you don't go outside of that and find any sort of value. And I think what you're getting at is breaking out of the rigid mindset, is having a non-dualistic way of seeing. Is it's not either or, it's both and. It's like you can be enough and you can be better. You can be struggling with this and you can also be progressing as well. But the shame creates the duality and the extremes to say, well, either I'm just nailing it and across the board, it's just the very best, or it's absolutely terrible. And you're starting to see these extreme archetypes play out among men, which is you have either guys that are just not performing at all, like, one step away from never trying again. And then these guys that are slowing down for no one and nothing. And these models, I think are such a crucial point. And you mentioned that you worked a lot in schools and community settings, not just a clinical practice. There's something so powerful about meeting boys and men where they are rather than making them wait to show up to therapy rooms. So I'm curious, what have you learned about masculine development by observing it in these natural environments in boyhood and schools? And how has that shaped your understanding of what healthy masculinity actually looks like?
Yeah, I mean, Wes, that's a really good question. I appreciate it. And I think you're right. It's like if you're just waiting, if your only source of data is the guys who walk through your office, like you're gonna get a pretty skewed sample here. And the reality is like, it's one way or another. I feel like that I'm never not on when it comes to this. So that makes sense. It's meaning that like I think I've just been in this long enough that I'm off just thinking about really the health of guys around me. And so I'm acutely aware of kind of when I hear things, see things, and it, one way or another, like I'm always an advocate, if that makes sense. It's like I know that if I meet a guy out in the community and they say, well, what do you do? And I say, oh, I'm a college professor, and oh, what do you research? And I tell them, and it's a guy. I know that look on his face, which is like, oh, and so I know how to kind of really quickly to adapt that, right? And to kind of can use my personality to disarm, right? And so that like again, if I'm on a flight and someone asks me that, like so that I don't have a 5 hour awkward flight, right? But I've also seen this thing like, or like I say that to my Uber driver, and then the next hour it's like, wait a minute, we need to reverse the fare on this because I'm giving you way more, because Uber drivers have no problem on my end, like just telling about their life story. And surprisingly high percentage of men who are Uber drivers seem like they've had time in therapy, I've noticed. But I'm also open to it, that makes sense. Like, I don't want to shame guys for telling me about that or make them feel stupid or talking about it. I want to actually, in a way enhance that risk they just took. I could call that vulnerability, right? But it's a risk that typically a guy like that is taking to kind of like share something that usually you might not share. And I guess I'm always looking for where I see that in places. And, again, it's like this whole thing of like when you just walking around, like when you see two guys digging a hole, do you say to yourself, there's two guys who are digging a hole? Or do you say to yourself, there's two guys digging a hole and they're probably, you know, maybe not having fun, but they're probably bonding, right? And I think there's a way in which like I shift my mentality. It's like if I see two women at a coffee shop and they're leaning intensely into each other and they're talking, I think like, oh, they're having an intimate conversation. They're close and they're sharing and it's intimate. And yet when I see two guys digging a hole, most people don't go like, there's two guys who are sharing intimacy. But the reality is they probably are. So, and it's not better or worse. It's just different. Right. And I think for me, it's as I begin to reframe and think about these things, I'm looking for ways in which how do we reframe the experiences that happen. So I'm in a school and a certain collection of kind of adolescent males may be viewed as problematic by some people. I may look at kind of like what is the potential in that as well. Like, are they screwing around? Like, and therefore we need to be, oh my gosh, or are they just being boys? Like they're not hurting anyone. Maybe they're a little louder than they could be, and I'm sure they could be quiet. But like, am I watching them just waiting for them to misstep, or am I watching them with a sense of pride and wonder? Like, hey, it's beautiful, right? And I think that's the piece. Again, it's like we do get kind of coded to police male behavior, and hey, sometimes it needs to be policed, right? But other times it really, really doesn't. And so I think that I'm just aware of this. Like I'm even aware, like I used to play in like a dad's basketball league, and it was a way that the school my kids are in, we're trying to build kind of engagement with fathers, right? And it was actually quite smart by the head of school because again, dads weren't in the school that much. There aren't a huge amount of male teachers, and it just brings engagement, and it had the desired effect, meaning that I think that the fathers are actually going into the school and they know where the school is, and they but they begin to kind of they begin to realize that, oh, that I know some of these other people here, so now if I go to a school function, I'm not going to be all alone and be like an accessory on my wife's kind of arm. that I'm going to see friends too, and it can be kind of fun. And I began to see how that kind of happened. But even in that basketball, what I would see is that, like, yeah, basketball can get competitive, and guys could get super competitive in those moments and yell and scream at each other and do that. And afterwards, they can also go hang out and have a beer afterwards. And I know that, like, as much as, like, I want to go play basketball and have fun, I also want to go hang out afterwards. Because at some level, there's a way in which, like, men in their 30s and 40s crave connection. So again, like, the dad's basketball isn't just about basketball, and understanding that a lot of things like that in men's lives as we get older, like, there's often other kind of context or subtext to it that should be enhanced, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
What came up for me when you were sharing that is Franz de Waal's research on rough and tumble play and how that correlates with, as men get older, having antisocial behavior. What it's correlated in there that I've never made this connection until you just said this is that the rough and tumble play historically interpreted as it's helped a boy find his limits. That way he knows what's socially acceptable, what's not. But when you just said that, what came up is actually there's another component of intimacy, of physical touch that bonds a guy. And it reminds me of being in middle school and when my buddy would punch me, and it's because I knew he liked me.
Yeah. 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 It's a love punch.
And yeah, it's a love punch, exactly. And within that, I think what you're getting at, what's really striking is that we have told boys and men to open up like girls and women. And this is why a lot of them don't want to go to therapy, because they just say, someone's telling me just to share my feelings, I'm out. I'm not, it's not going to work. Or just to talk about your day, not going to work. And this is where a lot of couple conflict comes from too. But what you're bringing up is when you create a space for men to be physically challenged, you restore the intimacy of bonds, because you are having an appropriate, let's say, mature developmental rough and tumble play with other guys. You're banging up against them, playing basketball and all these things. And like you're saying, now you've formed this subtle bond that makes you want to open up and say, talk about the game. That's usually where it starts, right? The informational level. Oh, you had a good shot, or that was funny when this happened, etc. But then that opens up a guy to then, if you have the skills, like you and I, but certainly any man can develop, is to take it to the next level. Oh, tell me about that. You mentioned that your wife says this to you, like, how'd you guys meet? And it opens up this conversation. Maybe it ends there, but maybe you do the what's famously known as the awkward exchange of asking for another guy's number.
Yeah.
And then next time you see him around, like you said, it's a little more normalized. And then slowly but surely, I think that is a step to helping many men who find themselves in isolation find community. So thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, Wes, and I as you said that, I was thinking it's when you say, like, show your emotions in therapy, right? I think what we've also done is we've really narrowly defined what that looks like, meaning that we've actually narrowly defined that in the way that therapists get trained. So counselors and therapists get trained, right, to have interpersonal intimacy in the moment, in the here and now, meaning that if I'm with you and you tell me, like, to tell me how that feels. And then I start telling you, and then I feel it, and you see the tear in my eye or the tension in my brow. Somehow you've succeeded as a therapist. Like, yes. And because we know that there can be, again, when that's validated back, right? We know that that actually is healthy emotional expression, right? Boom. It's not the only way to do it, but we really prioritize and narrow that interpersonal in the moment feeling of it in the moment is what we're looking for, when the reality, emotions can be expressed in many different ways, right? Emotions can be expressed in the body somatically, right? So as opposed to me feeling it, I may talk about, like, a grumbling in my stomach, a tension in my neck. Guess what? I'm feeling emotion right there, right? I can actually act it out. I could get up and I could kind of do something and I could show it. I can actually write it down, right? We know that actually expressive writing, for example, again, is an incredible intervention that actually leads to emotional expression, right? But as therapists, we really need to broaden our understanding of what emotional expression actually is. All of those things actually require validation back, meaning that when you express emotion and you're not seen, right, then the benefit goes away. We know that, right? So basically crying to cry, like, yeah, that has a physiological kind of thing on my own, but crying in your presence and having you talk about the weather, right, in response is not going to help me at all. I'm actually going to feel worse, right? Right. But the reality is we don't often see the other ways that men actually feel their emotions, and we don't actually invite those into therapy. And I think that that's something that is really critical in how I work with guys, which is I don't, if he's talking about it, and I learned this from one of my good friends, if he's talking about this, like, so I'm talking about like an experience with my dad, and it's really tense. And as a therapist, you're listening to me, and you may be kind of wondering, like, and why isn't he showing emotion? Like, he's talking about this really difficult thing with his dad, and yet he's just telling it to me. But if you watch me, you might see that I'm like twisting my hands a little bit, or I'm tensing a little bit. And the intervention that my colleague taught me is like, take a towel, like a hand towel, wrap it up really tight into like a stick, have him hold it. And then as he's talking, you'll notice that I begin to, and then I can draw attention like, hey, when you're talking about that thing with your dad, I noticed your hand really crunched up. What was happening there? Right. But again, it's that physical component. Like, I know, for example, I express a lot of my emotions through physicality. Like, that's my release. Like, I have to have some type of physical ways to bring things down. But I'm feeling things in my body, and I can tell you where much better than like explaining it to you in words, right? And a therapist who would be good for me would be able to see my body react and in a somatic way help me explore the somatic experience of my emotionality. And I think that's another way in which, again, that's an advanced way of working with guys. It would be in line with what guys might be actually presenting with, right? But it's not how we've sold therapy to guys. We sold therapy as come in and cry, and then you'll feel better. When most guys have been socialized as, wait a minute, when I cry, I feel worse. So why would I ever want to come to you and cry?
Yeah, and with the creative writing component, I'm curious if you've heard of James Pennebaker's work.
He's
Um,
the one. Yes, absolutely.
he's the best.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So there's certainly a creative component to allowing a man to express themselves, which we could go off on a whole nother thing. How there was a day when there was a Michelangelo who was fully masculine and also painting this, Sistine
Yeah.
Chapel. And
Yeah. Yeah.
what does that look like? But I think also what you're getting at in the emotionality side of things reminds me of how a lot of times I see men present anger as a very common emotion. They call it frustration, irritation, aggravation. And I'll tell them, go punch something. And they look at me shocked, like, what? Really? I can do that? And again, you said this so articulately, but we've policed men on how they are allowed to express themselves. Again, it needs to be appropriate, it needs to be accountable, put in check, but we can't suppress that. We certainly have to allow it to have space to be healthily expressed in a way that feels unique and true to someone else. And I love the towel idea. I'm gonna have to do that even on virtual. I'll just have them hold it up, instead.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
But I think there's so much there.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, and that's why, like, with boys, you have koosh balls, you have tactile things around them that they can hold on to. So it sounds ridiculous. Like, it sounds very, very cliche, but like, you know, why not have drums? And like, I know not every office can have drums. But again, that same friend who taught me the towel thing, he had a chance to rebuild his office, and he, built an office, a brick, and he put musical instruments in there, and he put a punching bag in there so that guys could come and they could scream all they wanted, and no one was going to have a problem because they couldn't hear him, right? But I mean, like, create spaces in which, like, again, if I go sit in a therapist's office and I see this chair and it just looks like, and everything is so soft, and it feels like, I'm going to break it if I breathe. And so then I'm going to come in and I'm not going to be me. I'm going to play this character of who I think you want me to be. And the reality is like, maybe that's not who I really am. So I want to be in a place where, in some ways, this is actually why telehealth can be helpful for guys, is they can be in their own environment and they can kind of have these other things that are grounding forces for them. They feel a little bit safer because sometimes our therapist office is so clinically oriented in a way that doesn't scream to guys, you're welcome. Like my colleague Holly Sweet wrote this chapter in a book I did in which she kind of said, like, walk into your office and start looking around and look for the anchors. Like, what is in your office that a guy says, this is for me? And I always kind of say, so this doesn't mean your office has to look like a bar, right? You don't need peanuts on the floor and like pretzels in a basket, but like, what is there that a guy is like, do you have that, Is your painting, the dark seas with the rowboat, is it a pastoral scene? Is there something else that like looks like a boy or a guy might be like, oh, I can relate to that? Like, is there something there that kind of like, again, it doesn't have to be so stereotypical, but it has to be something that kind of sends a message that this place is for me too.
That's right. We need symbolism for guys to correlate with and feel at home in. So I think either it's a CrossFit gym or your home, I think
Yeah.
are where we've settled on the best place to get it out.
Yeah. But it's funny as I say that because it's like, we all know that going to therapy, it can be a struggle for guys. Like we know that. That is the one finding we know from all this research is that more often than not, men are less inclined to seek psychological help. They're less inclined to seek help, period. Doesn't mean if it's therapist, mental health, physical health, directions at the gas station. Like now they won't even put on their, like, no, I know where I'm going. You have a phone. I'm not, nope, no. Like, we know that there's something about that. So if we know that, and we do know it, why wouldn't we actually begin then to kind of soften our outreach or tailor our outreach a little bit better so that the spaces look welcome?
Yeah, I think that's right. And taking the due diligence to use the language and appearance and these things that feel approachable to a guy. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's all right.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. It's like, that's why you're right. It's a gym. It's a CrossFit gym. It's a barber shop. Right. It's a shed, like the men's shed movement, and with older men, which is like taking these spaces in like assisted living and making it look like a garage. Right. It make actually is a garage. Doesn't look like it. Actually, it's a garage full of tools, and it's a place where some men feel a lot more comfortable. And so having these male oriented spaces doesn't mean it's a male only space. First of all, it doesn't mean no one can go there. And it doesn't mean a man cave is the source of misogyny. A man cave or a male oriented space is just a place where guys feel comfortable. So how do we kind of create, I mean, who said that therapy has to be the most uncomfortable place in the world? Yeah. I mean, Freud started that. Okay, great. But we're beyond that. Like we actually look at each other now. We can have comfortable chairs. We can have spaces that actually don't have to look like a clinical doctor's office, right? And the honestly, the people who I know who do really good work with men know this, right? And they've altered their spaces. They get out of the office. They do walk and talk therapy. They do a variety of things in which they kind of, essentially kind of try to tailor it so he feels comfortable when he comes in that space.
Yeah, and I think piggybacking on that, appropriate self-disclosure has been helpful for me as well. I'm a big runner and I like to go to the gym. And I think even telling a guy that, puts him at ease a little, like, oh, okay, he's like normal, he's not, and it's okay if you don't do those specific exercises, of course. But I think what you're getting at is, and this is a bit of where it's this symbiotic relationship where you can feel comfortable as a therapist or as a facilitator expressing your manhood to another man and just saying, okay, great, this is a space for me to share and connect. And your ability to do that or hint at it or create the space to invite another guy to gives us the best bet at them opening up. And as we both know, once a guy reaches that threshold, that critical point of being able to open up, good luck stopping them, right? I mean, that is a man on a mission who makes himself better, who makes the people around him better. And I really think that is the critical crucible that we're facing in society is getting men to that point to cross that threshold. And I think once we do, it'll be a tipping point that well, the research and also I just think the results will surprise us in the best way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, when I even talk to my students, I basically said like the main goal of session one is to get them to session two, right? So you figure out how you're going to do that, and if that means you have to really change some of your orientation, then that's what you need to do. What you said is, I think, why I liked working with guys initially. I could be me. I could self-disclose a little bit more. I knew my boundary. I knew what I was talking, like where I wasn't going to go, but I'd find ways to chit chat and tell some jokes. And, I'm a runner too. Like that's what I grew up in. And I know everyone, all genders are runners actually, right? So there's a lot of runners, but I also spent many hours running with a lot of dudes in cross country and track practices. And I know banter. Like I know how to have those conversations. And so there's a socialized male way in which I understand running, for example, that I can kind of engage with if I know he runs. Now, what if he does CrossFit or what if he hates running, but he crews? Well, I also can understand hard work, right? And I can understand kind of like, the mentality, what it takes to be someone who crews. Now, if I had no idea what crew was, and that's what he tells me he's into, I promise you over the next week, I'm going to figure out what crew is. I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna have questions and I'm gonna have him help me understand what he loves about it, right? Like, so I'm gonna play to his strengths and around that in a way. So again, so he feels like he actually has some skin in the game and he thinks that I have skin in the game with him.
Yeah, and you're doing the therapeutic rapport work of just showing you care. And I think many guys are actually very low maintenance in this regard. And you kind of said this earlier where it was easy to get into it, the work, not just because you feel known by them, but also because a lot of them are like, hey man, if I know that you like care about me, that you're good, you're not going to judge me, then we're good. I'll open up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate you taking the time today to share all your wisdom and guidance. And I may have to nudge you for a round too soon. But before I let you go, where can people find your work and figure out what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually working on a website right now, but in general, you can just find me through my academic contact at Cal State Fullerton. I'm pretty easy to find. The last name is kind of unique, and so people can usually track me down. And I think in terms of kind of what I'm doing these days, I'm spending a long time in schools. I work a lot in K-12 settings, looking at how do we operationalize kind of healthy boyhood throughout that setting, so that we create schools which kind of grow boys into healthy men. And from a nutshell, we know it's not rocket science where men go wrong later on in life. Like, we know where the needs are, we know why there's health disparities, we understand these kinds of things, and actually it's in typically adolescence and boyhood where these patterns get created. So how do we create healthy habits, and how do we help kind of boys kind of fully engage in a motivated, authentic way, that allows them to not lose touch, like you said, with that joy of boyhood, and not lose that actual playfulness in terms of who they are, and begin to make really healthy decisions for themselves and other people around them, so that they can actually have healthy relationships throughout their life. And I think that honestly is the task for us, for those in the helping professions, which is how do we show empathy towards men? I know that men engage in a lot of tough behavior and they cause a lot of damage. I can hold men responsible for the damage and the difficulties they do. And I can also have empathy for them too, in terms of kind of what led to that and kind of who they are as a person. I think if you can master that, you'll find that men want to see you and they want to see you beyond that first session.
Well said, a great place to end. And so thankful that you're in this space doing this work. It's very necessary and essential. And though you're a forerunner, there's some of us that aren't far behind you. So thank you.
Thanks, Wes. Appreciate it.